All right, g'day everybody. My name is Elliot Waters and you're listening to the Dysregulated podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, feel free to like, subscribe, share it around with your mates and give me a great 5-star rating on your podcast app. And if you want to contact me, you can certainly do so on Instagram at elliot.t.waters. Okay, today's episode is going to be a little bit different than the ones that have come previous. So in the previous episodes, I've done a lot of talking about me and my story, which is good. As you'll find out in a minute, that is one of the key objectives of the podcast. But there's another key objective I want to tick off as well. So this is part one of a 2-part series looking at left brain versus right brain dominance. Is it a thing? Is it important? What does it mean as far as our thoughts, our behaviours, our personality goes? And what does it mean when it comes to therapy? Very important stuff. So when I first started this podcast, I had 3 main objectives. The first one was that I wanted this show to act like my journal. So when I do presentations for the Black Dog Institute to school groups or community groups or whatever, I always tell the audience how important journaling is. And sometimes when I'm up there speaking in front of them, I feel like a bit of a fraud because I have never been able to really get on top of journal writing. Maybe it's the ADHD that stops me from completing that goal and being able to attend to that night in, night out. I'm not sure. But I've done the research. I've done assessments on this stuff. I know how important journaling is. And I also know that I can't really afford not to do it. So I thought, right, I need to hack the system. There's got to be a way that is more in line with me and my interests so I can do these journals regularly. So then I thought, right, what do I like? I like talking. Yeah. I like talking about me. Yeah. I like talking about psychology. Oh, yeah. And I love talking about psychology and me. So it was simple. Let's start talking about it. Let's record it. Create a podcast. So here we are. Now, once that was done, tick, which is good. My second objective was to create a podcast that would resonate with people, because something I've identified, again, probably through, doing the sort of lecture circuit, I suppose you could say, going around Australia, giving presentations, is that because my story covers a lot of broad areas, I've got like 6 or 7 mental illnesses diagnosed. There's a lot of subject material there. My story seems to resonate, which is great. And even if my story isn't exactly the same, there's a lot of commonalities there, which really I've found out later that it's not really a me thing, it's a humanity thing. Our stories do have commonalities, no matter where we come from. But at the same time, it did appear that my story and how I present seems to cut through, which is amazing. I'm so grateful that I can do that for people and for myself. Let's not forget that part. In fact, if you want to hear how much of an honour it is that I can do that, there's a great episode, My Greatest Honour. I definitely recommend you listen to it. Anyway, so the plan was with the podcast to come up with topics and talk about my own story in ways that people will understand and be like, haha, I do that too. It's not just me, and it definitely is not. So I think I'm doing that okay. I think. Feel free to give me some positive feedback on that because, again, my inner critic, which I've spoken about before, likes to say things that diminish what we're doing. So always looking for evidence to push back against my inner critic. Okay, so the third objective, which relates to today, is I wanted to use the podcast to flex my psychological science credentials. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but I have an honours degree in psychology now. Have I mentioned that before? Anyway, and there's a lot of things that I've supposedly learnt through my degree. There's plenty of things I've learnt outside of the degree, but there's probably just as many things that I've forgotten. So the plan was go back, do some of the topics that I've learned about or read about, really do some research into it, put into a podcast episode, make it understandable for people. And that way we together can improve our mental health literacy, which is so, so important. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to this stuff. So that's where we bring the episode today to this moment. Left brain, right brain hypothesis. This is a topic that is very big in psychology. It's very big in popular psychology, which is always a bit of a concern. So is it a real thing? What does the evidence say? And what does it mean for us? Well, let's find out. So first off, what is the hypothesis all about? Well, it is about this idea of hemispherical lateralization. Now, I already know in this episode I'm going to screw those words up, but hopefully I don't get tongue-tied. Hemispherical lateralization. This is the notion that different cognitions, behaviours, and personality traits are driven by one of the hemispheres. So the right side's pushing its narrative, the left side's doing its thing too. So let's put it another way, just so it's hopefully clear. Hemispheric lateralization is the idea that both hemispheres are functionally different and that certain mental processes and behaviours are mainly controlled by one hemisphere rather than the other. So it's almost like we've got two subpersonalities doing their thing and they live in each hemisphere of the brain. Anyway, stick with me. Hopefully it will make sense soon. All right, so let's have a look at some functionality. The left hemisphere controls the right-hand side of the body and receives information from the right visual field. Remember, left hemisphere, but we're talking right perception here. So receiving information from the right visual field and is implicated in controlling speech, language, and the recognition of words, letters, and numbers, plus a little bit more, as we'll see soon. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, or on the other side of the brain, controls the left-hand side of the body and receives information from the left visual field and is implicated in controlling creativity, context, and the recognition of faces, places, and objects. Bit different. The left and right are a little bit different, it appears. Now, just to do a bit of a demonstration of this whole crossing over thing, let's look at the visual field. So at the top of the forehead, sort of heading towards the top of the head in general, hope that makes sense, the optic chiasm is found. This is where the two visual streams coming in, so one stream is on the left eyeball, the other one goes through the right to the optic nerve and up the front of the forehead, and then these two streams converge and meet this point, which is the optic chiasm, and then they cross over. So what starts at the left goes up the head, crosses over, heads into the right side of the brain, and vice versa. So that's pretty cool. But when it comes to the intersection and integration of mental processes, which of course are driving our cognitions, our thoughts, our behaviour, and personality, another important subcortical, so that means right in the middle centre of the brain, part of the brain plays a key role. The corpus callosum, come on down, is a bundle of over 200 million, billion, gazillion, I think it's million, nerve fibres, which lies in the subcortical region of the brain, right in the middle. It connects the two hemispheres and allows the communication of different signals between both sides of the brain. Now, there's a pretty interesting side note here I want to mention. Now, obviously, I'm not a doctor, so this is a very generalised description of epilepsy, but let's see how we go. So, yes, people who have epilepsy and seizures sometimes have their corpus callosum split in two. This is called a corpus callostomy, and the idea is it stops seizure impulses from spreading over both hemispheres, lessening the intensity of the seizures. But this hemispherical disconnect, which causes a phenomena called split brain, can cause the hemispheres to form their own perceptions and impulses. Again, like two distinct subpersonalities. Wow. For example, let's go back to that visual stuff I was saying before. If you've got someone who's got split brain, when they're shown an image in the left half of each eye's visual field, and this stimulus is then sent to the right side of the brain, because remember, left crosses to right, because of the visual chiasm. Now, because the speech control center, okay, so language, most of language production and everything to do with comprehension, all that sort of stuff, is located on the left side of the brain. Now, remember, this stimulus, this object, went to the right, and there's no way of jumping across to the left because the corpus callosum is split. So what happens is, because all the speech stuff and verbalizing is on the left in the language, split brain individuals are unable to vocalize the object they have seen. They are unable, like I said, to get the message from the right brain, which is the one that got the message originally and perceived what they are seeing. They are unable to get that message back to the left so verbalization can occur. I reckon that's pretty cool. So some individuals with split brain, now this is cool, can even read 2 sets of text simultaneously. That would cure my ADHD. It would fix everything. Imagine how smart we would all be if we could read 2 texts at once. And can you believe it? Some individuals can. But it is not all good news if you have the split brain phenomena. And unfortunately, that might be a really, really good positive, but it doesn't quite outweigh the negatives. And of course, for that operation to happen, there has to be a pretty important reason to do it. So, but anyway, let's keep it in a context, but at the same time, that would be a pretty cool skill to have. So, as I said with language, okay, is all on the left side mostly, although we'll look at that in a minute. But generally speaking, each hemisphere has its own specialized functions. Therefore, communication between both, as we saw, is pretty important. But later on, we're going to see a flaw in this. It is not an absolute, as not many things in psychology are. So it's also important to note that the corpus callosum isn't just charged with connecting both hemispheres to facilitate the passing of info. Many of the nerve fibers found are actually inhibitory, which means it also separates the two further when required. Now, this separation appears, from when I read the literature, has come about because of evolutionary advantages. And from what I can understand, it is very much tied to the process of decision making. Now, in the next episode, the part 2 of this episode, I'm going to go through a lot of different therapies which sort of target each side of the brain and how it's helpful and the types of people that may benefit from whatever therapy that I'm mentioning. There's this idea in dialectical behaviour therapy where you've got the emotional mind, so let's call that the right. You've got the thinking mind, let's call that the left. And then what you need to do is synergize both streams of information to come up with a wise mind decision. So that is putting both together and evaluating what each side is saying. This is the best way forward with the evidence that has been shown to me. So, evolutionary advantage. Instead of just flying off the handle, driven by the right brain, the left brain is able to make up its own formulation, and then they come together. Instead of charging at that line, we decide maybe we might hang back a little bit. Something like that. That's how I conceptualize it anyway. Now, this split brain stuff I've been talking about has played a big role in the theory of, here's those words again, hemispherical lateralization. So let's get back to psychology. The theory holds that, like with examples of verbal production, visual perception, etc., that each hemisphere is specialized in producing different cognition processes, personality manifestations, and behaviours. So let's look at the personalities of each side of the brain. Let's start with the left. The left brain is the logical brain. Again, dialectical behaviour therapy, thinking logical brain. It sees the world in distinct shades of black and white, and if you're lucky, maybe a smidgen of grey, maybe. It is implicated with the use of language, which we've already spoken about, logical reasoning, makes sense, critical thinking, and is proficient in numeracy and problem solving. It is also important in memory and detail. More on this soon. Those who are left brain dominant are said to be extremely analytical and driven by logic, not letting emotions get in the way of making judgments. Sometimes they can be a little bit cold. Alternatively, for those who are right brain dominant, they see the world in vivid colour. They are creative, use intuition, they're imaginative, and importantly, seen as emotional types. No prizes for who can guess which side of the brain is dominant for me. Yes, you're right. I am unbelievably right brain dominant. Yes, I am so emotional and imaginative and you know, I have good intuition. Anyway, definitely emotional. So, research shows that the right brain also plays a role in language production, and we're going to revisit this later on. Now, here's a really good book, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World by Ian McGilchrist. So, Mr. McGilchrist, all these words that are hard to say, distinguished between the functions of both hemispheres like this. He's a bit of an expert in this area. The left brain, he believes, was designed with survival in mind. It narrows in on details, breaking our perceptual environments into bite-sized pieces and gaining from that a mechanistic, disembodied understanding of the world. It's all in bits. It's all about clarity, the removal of contextual cues and leaving us with the raw data of our surroundings. He goes on in his book to state that the left brain is relentlessly optimistic, more about its positive leanings later, as it discards anything that doesn't fit into its models of the world around us. So it blocks a lot of stuff out. Not interested in that. Right brain, don't want to care about your emotions, get away. On the other hand, or on the other side of the brain, the right brain has a very broad scope to encapsulate our sensory experience. It looks to connect with others, seeks novelty and spontaneity. It allows us to love and experience awe and wonder. Sounds like I'm reading the horoscopes. You know that feeling you get when you're watching the most beautiful sunset. I did it today. Beautiful. The clouds were there, the sun's going down, and you're just like, man, that is beautiful. I just want to soak that all in. Well, it's the right brain wanting to soak that all in. It tunes into that stuff. It loves it. Now, there's a good quote here that McGilchrist come up with in his book, and I think it sums up the relationship between the left and right in psychological terms pretty good. And it is, the right brain knows that it needs the left brain. The left brain doesn't know what it doesn't know. That's right. It only knows its specific things, and that's it. We're blocking out the rest. So the right brain, he hypothesized, is designed to lead and make sense of the constant chatter the left brain provides. Blah, blah, blah. All right. Let's get to what's really important, says the right brain. We want to find out what is going on in our immediate world in front of us and what objects, perceptions are actually important to navigate that, not the whole. And the right brain is very good at distinguishing between those different features and coming up with a very lovely narrative. Of note, though, now this is where the positive negative stuff comes into it. Research by Lane and Nadal in 2002 found that the left brain is strongly associated with positive emotion. It's just focusing on what it wants and having a great time, while the right side is more prone to negative emotion. Again, another great indicator that I am right-sided, but I'm not the only one, that's for sure. Here's a very interesting point, though. Perhaps this is my sort of idea here. The right brain is, well, it's associated with wonder and amazement, yeah, like sunsets, but it also carries, I think, the burden of knowing the depths of emotional turmoil, because empathy is a huge part of the right brain. You can't show empathy just for the good things. You've got to show empathy for all of it. It's all about imagining yourself in their shoes. How would that event have felt if that was me? Sometimes it's not a good event. So that's why I think perhaps the right brain is also really, into the negative stuff, because unfortunately there is a bit of that around us, which is a shame. Further, the left brain is very much the side which, I guess, makes sense of different situations in a very logical, methodical manner, while the right brain appears to then overlay this situation. It's like, okay, we've got the building blocks, they're sort of in order, that's good. Let's now, say this is a social setting, let's now apply the social norms, which result in acceptance of our social behaviours. The right brain is doing that. The left hemisphere breaks apart things into bits that are manageable. Then the right hemisphere puts it all together and produces a cohesive view of things, of our world. So this is how I sort of conceptualize it, that the left is all about the building blocks. It's the raw data. We can't draw conclusions from it until the right is able to put it all together, and then these conclusions, what these bits are trying to tell us, it all comes from there. So the right side puts it all together and creates this narrative around different situations. Okay, now let's go further into the realm of neuroscience. The left brain is aligned with the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the system that brings about the rest and digest state. So when you're just chilling, you're vegging out, everything's just operating on its own, you're digesting, you're breathing normally, your heart rate's pretty low, there's no adrenaline pumping. That is the parasympathetic nervous system at play. It is keeping everything within the status quo. Doesn't want to rock the boat. Now, the left brain, like I said, is aligned with that. Now, the right brain is tightly linked in with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, this is all about flight versus fight. This is all about adrenaline, getting ready to go. Boom, heart rate goes up. We're ready. Pupils dilate. We're getting all this sensory information. Come on. So this is important. The sympathetic nervous system is also implicated with the anxious response physiologically, which feeds psychological processes. So that's why medications like propranolol, for example, which lower that sort of physiological response to anxiety, as a secondary measure, helps psychological processes, because if you're thinking, oh man, my heart rate's up, having a panic attack, oh my God, that's really bad psychologically. Obviously, it feeds into that and makes it worse. But if all of a sudden your heart rate drops, the sweating stops, the hyperventilation, obviously you're starting to think, well, maybe things are all right. It's all good. So that's how beta blockers like propranolol work. And that's how the sympathetic nervous system is tied in with the psychological effects of anxiety. So that tells us, I think, let's see how clear it really is. Let's have a look. So that tells us that the right hemisphere plays a role here in anxiety, but it's just not that clear, unfortunately, as we'll find out in a little bit more in this episode. So there's a lot to digest. Speaking of digestion, so let's do a little recap. The left side is logical, black and white sort of thinking. It's associated with positive emotion and the resting state. That's the parasympathetic. The right side, on the other hand, or on the other side of the brain, I need to stop using that pun, sees the world in vivid colour, is driven by emotion, and draws the big picture. It is linked to negative emotion and the sympathetic nervous system, which is in turn associated with the anxious response. But it's just not that simple. But before we get to that point, let's have a look at how the mental illnesses and the two hemispheres engage with each other. So let's start with one that I've already mentioned, ADHD. This is a disorder of extreme procrastination, of being unorderly. There's emotional dysregulation, hence the name of the podcast. We have poor attention. We can be impulsive and also hyperactive. Now, of course, you're not always hyperactive or you're not always inattentive with ADHD. Sometimes you're both, one or the other. But anyway, that will be another episode. Now, this is very much a right brain dominant disorder, you would say. That would, I think, be a logical, left brain driven decision to come to. So a passive left brain tends to equal lack of routine, poor attention to detail, lowered attentional abilities, and is overrun by short-term gratification, driven by the right side. And you also see a lot of memory problems as well. So let's do a little example of me. So the other day, I got a phone call from my doctors and they said, Elliot, where are you? You've got an appointment today. And I said, nope, you got it wrong. It's not the 9th, it's the 13th. I've got on my little piece of paper you gave me, 100%. Anyway, they were adamant I was meant to be there and I missed this appointment. So I went back to the car and looked at this little slip they give you, and it definitely said the 13th on it. The problem was it was the 13th of December 2021. Now, I'd been looking at this little slip for ages because I was sort of looking forward to going to the doctors. I had a little bit to report. I didn't get past the first two numbers, the date, the day, 13th. It was an old one. I'd misplaced the current slip, which would have fixed all. So there you go. There's an example of not concentrating, not being organised, and poor attention to detail. My left brain is smothered. So a dominant right brain produces heightened sympathetic nervous system activity. So again, flight or fight, causing as well hyperactivity because all that adrenaline's pumping, all that energy, poor concentration because you're buzzing around, and poor organisational abilities and the individual is driven by short-term emotional behaviour seeking and associated impulsivity. So this leads us to substance abuse. Now this again makes sense. Well, I think it makes sense because the right brain drives pleasure seeking. These people, of which I would also say I'm one, are wanting, needing novelty and looking to experience things outside the usual. Now, we've got to be careful. There's a lot of different theories in neuroscience, in psychology, psychiatry. There is a very strong theory related to dopamine and pleasure seeking. Now, this sort of hijacks that a little bit. So I just want to do a bit of warning. This episode, of course, is look through the paradigm of right versus left. So there are a lot of other theories that can explain these things as well. And that is a point where I think the dopaminergic theory explains it a little bit better. But again, the right brain idea still works here. So like I said, right brain drives pleasure seeking. Novelty. We want to experience things outside the norm. It's what we're all about. This is how we get our kicks. The right brain, being associated with negative emotion, also drives substance abuse in the way of self-medication. My last episode, what did I say? The big three: nicotine, caffeine, amphetamine, which I want to note, by the way, when I say amphetamine, I'm talking about prescribed medication. I just thought I'd put that out there. But at the same time, I'm using all those things to self-medicate. And especially for caffeine, I've been given it's not really a disorder, but they give it to you as sort of a way to create, again, a framework for recovery. Caffeine use disorder. I have that on my medical records because I self-medicate, because possibly I'm right brain dominant. Now, that's all good. Now let's go to depression. Again, it makes sense. The right brain is implicated in negative emotions. If the right brain is dominant and it is seeing stimuli in the world which it perceives as negative, that negative emotion will be amplified. So that's where depression certainly fits in with this theory. Now let's go even deeper. Love going deeper. Personality disorders, in particular cluster B personality disorders, we're going to use as our example. So that is borderline, histrionic, narcissistic, and antisocial personality disorders. These disorders, of which, of course, I have borderline personality disorder, are typified by extreme emotional reactions, can be seen as being overly dramatic, erratic, and prone to outbursts. This is right brain dominance right here. So those with personality disorders, such as me, find it very difficult to let the logical side have its word. The left side of the brain is smothered by the all-conquering right side of the brain. It is only after a negative event, quite often, this is so true, or outburst that has taken place, I'm thinking of so many, once the sympathetic system, remember fight or flight, adrenaline, has calmed down and the parasympathetic system takes over physiologically, at the same time, you generally see the left side takes over psychologically as well. It's then that we, or individuals such as me, tend to see the events clearly. The clouds are gone, the emotional clouds are gone, now we're seeing what's left, and sometimes, well, we've overstepped just a little bit. Again, right brain, just dominating proceedings, jumping to conclusions, driven by emotion, and not always good emotion either. Now, let's have a look at another disorder that's very interesting that I haven't mentioned on the podcast yet. This is schizophrenia. What is schizophrenia? Well, it is an illness characterized by disordered thoughts all over the shop, going which way and every way. Paranoia, hallucinations and delusions, which can lead to psychosis. And all of this stuff is severely out of touch with reality. So it appears, thanks to evidence put forward by, in this case, Mitchell and Crow from the School of Psychology at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom, hello to the UK listeners, that schizophrenia is a disorder of a failure of integration of right and left hemispheric functions. They're just not talking to each other. They found that some language functions of those with the disorder were mediated or controlled. I'm talking slowly for a reason here. Remember, language, left side, I'll start that again. But remember, language left side. They found that some language functions of those with the disorder were mediated or controlled by the right hemisphere rather than the conventional left side. Oh, geez, that is an extra layer of complexity we did not need. The right side does do some language work, though. I did mention that at the start. Remember that higher order communicative functions like emotional language and conveying intent, using subtlety. Again, tying into the social cues sort of thing. Right hemisphere still has its own function with language production. But in this case of schizophrenia, because the right side is doing more of the heavy lifting than it normally would be, it is being seen as overactive and over-dominant. And to continue with this, according to the theory put forward, the clear and concise delivery and understanding of language is diminished in those with schizophrenia because those parts of the brain on the left side have a reduction in function. So the right's gone up with its workload and the left, as a result, has gone down and a bit lower and is not pushing through as much as you would normally see when it comes to language production. So instead, the right side is overlaying multiple levels of meaning. All these different meanings, different situations, coming from everywhere. Remember the disordered thinking. And this produces the incoherent speech, understanding, the disordered thoughts, cognitions that are out of whack, and ultimately psychosis as well. It is a terrible, terrible disorder. The left brain just is not able to communicate. It's black and white approach, which brings with it clarity. So we are lacking clarity because that black and white just is not resonating throughout the brain and then being produced in a way that is understandable. So this is compelling evidence, though, for the theory so far. But as we've seen with schizophrenia, all of a sudden we're seeing there's actually a bit more going on than just strictly left, strictly right. So is this really that clear cut? No. As with most theories of psychology, it just isn't. Right brain dominance is implicated with various mental health issues. This is true, but the left brain isn't exempt from examination either. This isn't just a right brain story. So, for example, let's look at one of my favorites, anxiety. Ugh. Researchers Miller and Heller from the University of Illinois did some investigation into the psychophysiology of anxiety disorders. So remember, there's not just anxiety, there's at least 4 subtypes, and then a lot of people believe there's actually a lot more than that as well. So anyway, so their findings showed that there is a difference between those classes having an anxiety disorder who typically are seen to fret, ruminate, that is, think about the past, and worry, compared to those who experience the more physiological sensations of anxiety, such as panic, sweats, and rapid heartbeat. So for me, I'm a fretter, I'm a ruminator, I'm a worrier. I do the panic, the sweats, and the rapid heartbeat as well, but nowhere near as much as the other type. That's me. But again, everyone is different. They characterize these two states as high anxious apprehension, that would be me, versus the high anxious arousal types. So using fMRI technology, they found the anxious apprehension group showed an increase in left inferior frontal lobe activity. So really what we can take from that is left. The anxious arousal group had greater activity centered on the right hemisphere temporal lobe, which is the side of the brain near the temple and a little bit behind near the ear, which is involved in responding to threat. And I've mentioned the amygdala before, but the subcortical amygdala, which is so important when it comes to fear, perception, and aggression. You'll never believe it. It's there behind the temporal lobe, deep into the subcortical regions. Shocker. So in simpler and diagnostic terms, let's use actual diagnoses here to sort of make sense of this. Those with generalized anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder showed higher left brain activation compared with those diagnosed with panic disorder or those exposed to high stress situations in their environment. So here we go. This is where it sort of falls apart a little bit. Anxiety split down the middle. Some anxieties are worse on the right side and some are on the left. So all of a sudden, maybe these hemispheres aren't thinking separately, like two separate beings after all. So let's again look more broadly. Let's look at language this time. So as we have seen, as I've mentioned throughout this episode, language comprehension and production usually takes place on the left side. Okay, so we know this because there's areas of the brain which I'll probably mispronounce, Wernicke's and Broca's areas, where production of language and comprehension, we know it goes from there. Now, how do we know this? Because neuropsychologists have shown in patients who have damage to these areas have specific and reliable deficiencies, such as poor comprehension, production, or little ability at all. So we know that this is true. But it has also been evidenced, there is always a but with this stuff. But it has also been evidenced, as noted previously, that the emotional quality of speech and the use of profound language and knowing when to use it, that's important, seems to come from the right side, or at least partly. It does have input. More evidence that sort of works against the whole theory is found with experiments that take, let's say, a person who's really logical, so the opposite of me, such as a mathematician or a physician or, hard science sort of person. And let's grab another person who's creative, like a musician. Go to the local music bar, grab the songwriter of the band, and we'll get him into this experiment as well. So they're at two ends of this spectrum, theoretically. What a lot of this research has found is when these two types of people, or obviously groups of people who are like this, are exposed to different tasks or stimuli, the same areas of each hemisphere light up to complete the task at similar rates. So there is no significant individual differences really about the use of either hemisphere across the various tasks. Now, some of these tasks are right brain affiliated, some are left. But what you see is to complete each one, like I said, the whole brain is doing its thing. So this raises some questions. For example, is there really individual hemispheres doing its own thing? Hey, this is a right brain task. It's all right, left brain, leave it to me. This is my domain. I've got this. Is this what the research showed? No, not really. Both sides are lighting up. Even if it's task specific, like I just said, this is right brain. Well, guess what? The left brain is working away as well. So there you go. So this sort of suggests maybe it's not about left brain, right brain. It might be more of a case of the whole brain or the subcomponents of the brain that need to be working together. It doesn't matter what side of the brain they're on. They've got connectivity and they're doing their thing working in tandem. So maybe the left and right hemispheres aren't as disconnected and individual as we thought. More evidence that may suggest this was brought forward by Nielsen and colleagues in 2013. So again, using fMRI technology, they evaluated the left brain, right brain dominant hypothesis that we've been looking at today by measuring resting state functional connectivity across both hemispheres. They produced results showing localized neural pathways and specific brain regions being different among participants, but not global, as in whole brain or whole hemisphere differences across the brain network. So really, when you're someone like me who is supposedly right brain dominant, it might actually be I am a person who has an overactive amygdala that happens to be the one on the right side. Possibly. Or if I'm not very good with language, maybe it's because Wernicke's and Broca's areas aren't as in tune as some other people, not the whole left side. Maybe because I can't organize things well, a little bit impulsive, it's because my prefrontal cortex, the neurons there aren't as solidified and developed as some other people. It's not actually left or right. It is the specific brain regions that just happen to be, arranged on certain sides of the brain, different areas. So the conclusion from Nielsen and colleagues was that lateralization of brain connections was confined to local specific regions. and refuted the idea that our brains are clearly dominant by one hemisphere or another. It's the actual smaller regions that appear to be dominant. Okay, clear as mud, I know. This is difficult because there seems to be evidence for both. And you know what? You look at the academic research, there is evidence for both. Now, this is my opinion. This is what I think of all of this. So I think the hemispheric lateralization theory is able to be generalized to some illnesses better than others. You know, obviously. That's sort of what we've seen. Anxiety, maybe not very well. Borderline personality, maybe a bit better. But I think the take-home lesson is that none of this is black and white, as the left brain would try and have you believe. It is therefore important in clinical settings, the psychologists and psychiatrists, that they evaluate each individual on a case-by-case basis. Man, I believe that, and it is not always the way it happens. Anyway, we're going to go into that more on the follow-up episode. That is for sure. I've got some very strong views about that one, let me tell you. Anyway, so for example, let's look at me. I myself have a whole raft of mental illnesses. How lucky. Good for the podcast, but not great for my day-to-day living. But anyway, and it appears I would have overactive and underactive or dysregulated, there's that amazing word again, elements of each hemisphere. Again, amygdala, overactive, prefrontal cortex, possibly underactive. Okay, and I suspect from my own personal experience that a lot of this is situational. What is the environment throwing up at me? And it sort of depends on what it is, which is how my brain will react to it, which sort of makes sense, right? It also leads me to believe that we can't really view each hemisphere as a whole separate entity. You just can't, but you sort of can. But you can't because it's actually the subcomponents that make up each hemisphere, which is where the detailed truth lies. It just so happens that many of these components with similar functions are found on either side of the brain, so you can understand why people have this thinking. But with that in mind, I'm not rubbishing the whole left versus right brain idea at all. I actually think that the left brain, right brain conceptualization has really good utility in explaining to people, such as in a clinical psychology setting, why their personality traits are the way they are. It is a great way to categorize and sort of use these categories as a bit of a help, bit of a clue on how to proceed in therapy. Again, next episode. And I might add, like I said before, the research is a bit all over the shop with this sort of stuff. I wouldn't say that the left brain, right brain hypothesis has certainly been thrown out of academic circles. Definitely not. Definitely not. There was a paper I read the other day from Harvard University, which was published last year. And basically their conclusion was, although it appears the left brain, right brain hypothesis isn't that clear cut, it just seems to feel right and they think there's more to it. And I'll tell you what, I maybe tend to agree. All right. So now let's look at real world examples, behaviours and ways of thinking. Left brain dominant types will be very orderly. They will have tidy homes, use a Google Calendar. Now you may remember from an earlier episode my disdain of using Google Calendar, and I can tell you right now it has not improved at all. Left brain people will know when everyone's birthday is, but they still come off a bit cold. Right brain types are more into reading, music, often playing and composing music of their own, writing and having a strong friendship base. They seek pleasure, possibly to counteract the negative skew they have, and are ruled by emotion, the good and the bad. They are the dreamers and the types to do things differently. Hell yeah, we are. This, I'd like to think, is a positive of my right brain dominance. Definitely. But it's true. It's what drives me to do this podcast, for example, and have the passion and I suppose enthusiasm to do what I can in the mental health realm. I think that is exactly what is driving me to do these sorts of things. So go the right brain. It's not all bad. As I am lower on the left brain side, I tend to struggle so much with this detail and routine, like forgetting doctor's appointments and not being able to do journal articles. Not journal articles. If only. Journal entries. And these are two things people with ADHD need really, really badly. So, yes, it is difficult for us right brain dominant people because often what we need to live a better life is the stuff that's on the other side. So anyway, I guess a nice way of summing up, I come up with this myself, of how left brain versus right brain dominant people conduct their lives, I think is like this. If you're left brain, you will never let your fuel gauge go below half. While me and my fellow right brainers, we are always trying to play the kilometres till empty game. And I've lost that more than once. So, what about the degree of dominance between the hemispheres? Like everything, moderation is key. And in the realm of right-left hemisphere influence, this really is no different. Those who are seen to be more balanced, you can guess where this is going, between the hemispheres are typically less at risk for mental illness. I hate balance, or at least I'm not good at it. Anyway, the greater the asymmetry, the more dysfunctional the person seems to be with their thought process and behaviours. It's just the reality, balance, moderation, it's all key. So in fact, DBT, like I said before, dialectical behaviour therapy, which we're going to look at a lot soon on the next episode, does try to directly address this imbalance from the psychological viewpoint. In brief, the goal is basically to tap into both hemispherical inputs and then synergize the info and be like, right, this is the way to proceed because we've got all the evidence. Now let's go, instead of just firing off with whatever the right brain is throwing at it, which usually is emotion. So within DBT, like I said, the left brain is the thinking brain and the right brain is the emotional. And what we want to do is create the wise mind, which is the synergy of both. So, to sum up this episode, that was a lot of information. If you've listened this far, thank you so much. This is a big one. To sum up what we have discussed, let's have a look. We can look at the brain as a whole made up of two distinct hemispheres glued together by the corpus callosum, of course, which you can split. Each pivot towards certain cognitions, ways of thinking, personality traits, behaviours, all of that sort of stuff. Although much research supports this general premise, and it does, definitely does, each hemisphere, it seems, borrows grey matter and neuronal processes from each other, and then it formulates, I guess, a consensus of our world. But when this balance is tilted one way or the other, and an overly dominant side is found, usually the right side, when evaluating impacts on mental health, of course, that's what we're talking about, that's when you see these different mental illnesses arise. Like most concepts and theories in psychology, this is not cut and dry. It never is. But it does provide us with a solid framework to evaluate mental illnesses and direct therapy moving forward. So in the next episode, part 2, we're going to see that this has really broad implications for therapeutic approaches and the pathway towards peace of mind. There are specific therapies created for the left brain and the right brain, and it is so important that your therapist identifies which one is better suited to you. And to give you a head start on making sure that happens, the next episode is going to go all through that. Okay, that was a big episode. Thank you to everybody who has listened. I hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, please feel free to message me on Instagram. Remember, it is at elliot.t.waters. We covered a lot there. Psychology, neuroscience, neuropsychology, psychiatric evaluation stuff, anatomy. It was all happening. So hopefully that makes sense. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you have got your own peace of mind and perhaps this episode has helped you on that journey. Thank you very much. Goodbye.